He was a wealthy black businessman preparing to celebrate his 70th birthday. But what he didn't know was that his own daughter and her husband were plotting to poison him that very night. What happened next will leave you speechless. Watch to the end to find out how this shocking story ends. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The lakefront estate of George Thornhill stood dignified against the fading autumn sky, its grand silhouette framed by rustling golden trees and the soft ripple of the water nearby. The air was cool but gentle, a peacefulness hanging over the property like a well-worn blanket. Inside, however, the house buzzed with activity, not the bustling of hired staff or event planners, but the careful and deliberate movements of his daughter, Ivy, and her husband, Thomas. George had always imagined that when his 70th birthday came, it would be just like this. Intimate, warm, filled with the people he loved. He never had many friends. His world had always revolved around two things: the empire he built from scratch and his only daughter. Seeing Ivy now, hanging lights in the dining room and thoughtfully arranging silverware on the table, filled him with a rare kind of satisfaction. His heart softened each time he caught her humming to herself, a sound he hadn't heard since she was a teenager. "Thomas," Ivy called from the dining room, her tone clipped. "Can you please make sure the champagne is chilled?" "I'm on it," he replied smoothly from the kitchen, a polite smile touching his lips. Thomas moved through the house with the practiced charm of a man used to performing for an audience. Tall, with sharp features and a neatly trimmed beard, he looked every bit the supportive son-in-law. But beneath that polished veneer, there was calculation in his gaze. He glanced toward Ivy as she bent over the table, then away toward the hallway where George had just disappeared into his study. They hadn't seen George this happy in years, and that made everything more complicated. "I think he's softened," Ivy muttered when they were briefly alone in the kitchen. "He keeps looking at me like I'm 5 again." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "He's relaxed. That's good. Makes everything easier." She flinched slightly. "Don't say it like that." Thomas stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know what's at stake. If we don't do this, we'll be stuck waiting for years. You said it yourself. He could live to be 95, and we're drowning." Ivy bit her lip, her eyes flicking to the kitchen window where the lake shimmered in the afternoon light. "He's my father. And yet, he's never given you control of anything, never made you a partner, just dangles everything in front of you like a prize you'll never win." Thomas's voice hardened. "You deserve better. We both do." She didn't answer. They returned to their tasks, the tension buried under layers of practiced normalcy. When George reappeared to check on the progress, Ivy beamed and led him to the parlor to show off the decorations. Thomas followed, offering compliments and cracking small jokes that made George laugh. Later, as evening fell and the help retired for the night, the three of them shared a quiet meal in the dining room. The soft light of the chandelier above cast a gentle glow on George's weathered face, making the deep lines beside his eyes appear softer. Ivy served the meal herself. George had always said nothing beat his daughter's roasted lamb, and watched with an unreadable expression as he took each bite with gratitude. "I can't tell you how much this means to me," George said warmly, lifting his glass. "Having you both here like this, it feels right." Thomas raised his glass. "To family." They drank, and George smiled, but beneath that smile, something stirred, an unease, a shadow. That night, long after George had gone upstairs to sleep, Ivy and Thomas sat in the kitchen. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock. "Tomorrow," Thomas whispered. Ivy nodded, her face pale. Tomorrow. She didn't notice George standing silently at the top of the stairs in the darkness just beyond their view. He had come back down for a book, an old journal he liked to read before bed, and paused when he heard voices. At first, he thought it was nothing, just murmurs between a tired couple. But then he caught fragments, a word, a tone, the unmistakable chill of something deeply wrong. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. Put it in the tea. He drinks it every night at 8. You said it's painless. Once it's done, we'll finally be free. George's hand tightened on the banister. His mind reeled and his chest tightened, but he made no sound. Slowly, quietly, he backed away and returned to his room, closing the door behind him without a creak. He sat down heavily on the edge of his bed, the book still in his hand. For a long moment, he didn't move. He felt the kind of pain that made no sound, a hollow, crumbling collapse deep in the chest. His daughter, his only child. He opened the book, not to read, but just to hold something familiar, something real. The past came flooding back. The years of building his company, the joy of holding Ivy when she was born, the way she used to cling to his neck as a toddler, afraid of thunderstorms, and now this, a storm of another kind. He closed his eyes. He could explode. He could call the police. He could throw them both out into the night. But none of that would give him what he really wanted, understanding, and perhaps justice. No, he would not act rashly, not yet. Let them believe he knew nothing. Let them carry on with their plan. He would wait, and when the time came, he would be ready. The next morning unfolded with deceptive calm. Autumn light streamed in through the tall windows of the Thornhill estate, casting warm reflections across the polished hardwood floors. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, cloves, and pine. Ivy had arranged scented candles throughout the house to create a cozy, festive atmosphere. It was George's official birthday, and the small guest list was expected to arrive by evening. Ivy stood at the kitchen counter, slicing strawberries for the cake she planned to bake herself, a gesture George would find sentimental. But her hands trembled slightly. Every movement felt heavier than usual, like her own body was resisting what her mind had already agreed to. Thomas entered the kitchen quietly and watched her from behind. "You didn't sleep much," he said. She didn't turn around. "Neither did you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're not having second thoughts, are you?" She finally looked up, her jaw tense. "It's not as simple as you want it to be, Thomas. This isn't just a man. It's my father." Thomas let out a sigh and leaned against the counter. "And what has your father done for you lately, Ivy? You've bent over backward for him your whole life, and what do you get in return? Pocket money, cold praise, a pat on the back. The company is still completely in his control, and he's made it clear he's not giving up anything until he's gone. He built that company," she replied flatly. "With your mother's life, with your childhood," Thomas snapped back. "He was never there, Ivy. Not for her, not for you. Just work. Always work. That legacy he's so proud of, you're not a part of it." His words lingered in the air. Ivy turned her gaze back to the strawberries and resumed slicing them, slower this time. "You said you wanted freedom," Thomas continued. "You said you were tired of living in his shadow. Well, this is our only chance. Do you really think he'll last another year without rewriting that will?" Ivy's hand paused mid-slice. "The tea?" "Tonight," he said, "after the guests leave. It'll be just us three. You'll serve it. He won't suspect a thing." She swallowed hard and gave a single nod. Upstairs, George stood before the large mirror in his bedroom, knotting his burgundy tie with slow, methodical movements. His face was expressionless, his dark eyes calm, but inside a fire burned. He had heard everything again. They were too careless, too sure of themselves. They thought he was old and slow, that he couldn't see through their rehearsed concern. He turned away from the mirror and walked to his desk. From a drawer, he pulled out a small black notebook and jotted something down. It wasn't rage that guided him now, it was clarity. He had spent a lifetime studying people, making decisions, taking risks. He had built a corporation from nothing, weathered lawsuits, betrayals, and economic crises. This would be no different. He just hadn't expected it to come from his own blood. As the day wore on, Ivy and Thomas performed their roles with unsettling grace. They welcomed the few guests with warmth, made sure every detail was perfect, and remained by George's side like loyal companions. Ivy laughed more than usual. Her voice was too high-pitched, too practiced. Thomas poured drinks, made polite small talk, and checked the time every 10 minutes. The evening passed in quiet celebration. George accepted the guests' gifts and toasts with gratitude, but he watched his daughter carefully, noting the way her smile faltered when she thought no one was looking, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her hands never stopped moving. By 9 p.m., the last of the guests had left. The house was silent again. Ivy stood in the kitchen, staring down at the teacups lined up on the tray. Her breath was shallow, her skin cold. She reached for the small bottle Thomas had placed near the spice rack hours earlier. Inside was a clear, odorless liquid. She opened it with trembling fingers and carefully added a few drops to one of the cups, the one with the etched gold rim that George always preferred. Thomas entered the kitchen behind her. "You're doing the right thing," he said softly. She didn't respond. They carried the tray into the living room together, where George sat in his armchair flipping through an old photo album. He looked up and smiled as they entered. "Well," he said, closing the book, "I can't remember the last time I felt so loved. Thank you both for everything." "Of course, Daddy," Ivy said, setting the tray down and handing him the cup with the gold rim. "You deserve it." He took it with a nod of appreciation and raised it slightly in a toast. "To family." Thomas and Ivy echoed him. They sat quietly, sipping their own tea, their eyes locked on George's cup every time he lifted it to his lips. The minutes stretched on like hours. George sipped slowly, occasionally chuckling at old stories, completely at ease. Or so it seemed. Ivy's heart thundered in her chest. Her palms were damp. She kept glancing at the grandfather clock across the room. 10 minutes passed. Nothing happened. George looked perfectly fine. Alert, cheerful even. He finished the tea, set the cup down, and smiled. "Well," he said, rising slowly to his feet, "that was refreshing." Thomas looked at Ivy. Ivy looked at the cup. George walked over to the fireplace and stood in silence, his back to them. Then he turned. "I have to say," he began, "it's strange. You'd think after all these years I wouldn't be surprised anymore by what people are capable of." Ivy's eyes widened. Thomas straightened in his chair. George stepped closer, his tone calm but razor sharp. "You both really thought I wouldn't notice? That I'm just an old man who doesn't pay attention?" Thomas stood up. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the poison you put in my tea," George said, his voice low and deliberate. "I know everything." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Ivy turned pale. "I overheard you," George continued. "Last night, and again this morning. You weren't as careful as you thought." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but George held up a hand. "I drank that tea knowing what you intended," he said. "I just wanted to see if you'd go through with it." Ivy covered her mouth, shaking her head. No, I didn't mean to." "Yes, you did," George cut her off. "You both did, and now you're going to face the consequences." His voice was no longer warm or paternal. It was cold steel. Then he said something that made both their hearts stop. "But I'm not the one who drank the poison." The silence after George's final words struck like a thunderclap. Ivy stared at him, lips parted in disbelief, while Thomas froze, calculating. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire house stopped breathing. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound, a mocking whisper in a room suddenly drowning in fear. What do you mean?" Ivy finally managed, her voice hoarse, barely audible. George's expression didn't change. He didn't blink, didn't move closer, didn't even raise his voice. "I mean exactly what I said," he replied. "You poisoned the wrong cup." Thomas took a sharp breath and immediately looked down at his own teacup. Ivy's eyes followed, her face twisting in terror. Her body trembled. "No," Thomas said quickly, shaking his head. "That's not possible. I made sure." George tilted his head. "Did you? You seem very sure of yourself for a man who just tried to kill his father-in-law." "I didn't," he began, but then stopped. What excuse could he offer now? What mask could he put on that would change what they all knew? Ivy began to hyperventilate. She dropped her teacup, which shattered loudly against the hardwood floor, splashing what little remained of her drink across the carpet. "You're lying," she whispered. "You're lying, Daddy. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't." "I wouldn't?" George asked, his voice steady. "I built an empire with people who would have sold their mothers for a contract. I survived boardroom betrayals, financial traps, and corporate espionage. And you think I'd let my own daughter murder me in my own home without a fight?" Tears streamed down Ivy's face. She covered her mouth with both hands, rocking slightly in place. Thomas, however, stood still, his eyes locked on George, narrowing. "If you did something to us," he said slowly, "if you poisoned us, then you're not better than we are." George's expression didn't waver. "Maybe I'm not," he said, "but I didn't kill anyone, not yet." The air grew heavy again. Ivy dropped to her knees, clawing at the carpet, sobbing. "Please, Daddy, please don't let me die. I didn't mean to. It was Thomas. He pushed me." "Don't you dare," Thomas snapped. "You were part of this. You knew what we were doing, and you agreed." "You said it would be easy," she screamed, turning on him. "You said we wouldn't get caught. You said it was the only way." George raised a hand, and the room went quiet. "Enough." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small vial, identical to the one they had used. He held it up for both to see. "This is what you put in my cup," he said, "but I switched them before I sat down." Ivy's face turned gray. "Then, is it in mine? Or his?" George shook his head. "That's for you two to wonder." Thomas lunged forward, but George stepped back calmly. "Try anything stupid, Thomas, and I will call the police this minute. I haven't yet, but I can." Ivy collapsed into sobs again. "Please, Daddy, please. I'll do anything. Just help me. If there's an antidote—" "There is," George said. They both looked up at once. "But I'm not giving it for free," he continued. "You want to live? Then you're going to do exactly what I say." Thomas clenched his fists. "What do you want?" George stepped towards the center of the room, looking down at both of them like a judge before the condemned. "You're going to make a video," he said, "right now. A confession. Every word of the truth. How you plotted to kill me. Why? Who did what? No lies." "What?" Ivy gasped. "You heard me," he said. "Full confession. I'll record it. You'll sign it afterward. I'll keep it as protection." "And if we do?" Thomas asked through gritted teeth. "Then I'll give you the antidote," George said, "and you'll leave this house tonight with nothing." "Nothing?" Ivy whispered. "You're out of the will, out of my home, out of my life." Ivy looked at Thomas in desperation, but his face had hardened into stone. She turned back to her father, tears still falling. "And if we don't confess?" George stared directly into her soul. "Then you'll live the rest of this night wondering if what you drank is killing you." A full minute passed in silence. Then Ivy slowly stood up, knees trembling, and nodded. "I'll do it." Thomas stayed silent. George didn't press. He knew the man had no better options. He walked to his office, returned with his phone and a small tripod, and set it up. Ivy sat on the couch, pale and hollow-eyed. Thomas joined her reluctantly. The recording began. One after the other, they spoke. Ivy admitted to everything, her resentment, her weakness, her role in the plan. She named Thomas as the one who procured the poison and pressured her. Thomas, his pride stripped away, confessed too, trying to sound emotionless, but growing more desperate as the minutes dragged on. When they finished, George saved the file and backed it up to 3 locations. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just left the room. Minutes later, he returned and placed a small box on the coffee table in front of them. "The antidote," he said. Ivy grabbed it with trembling hands. She hesitated only briefly before downing it. Thomas followed, swallowing it with visible disgust. And then George looked at them. Really looked. Not with hate, not with pity, but with something far colder. "You're dead to me." He walked out of the room. They were left sitting in silence, surrounded by birthday decorations, confetti, and pieces of shattered porcelain. A scene meant for celebration now twisted into something neither of them could have imagined. The atmosphere inside the Thornhill estate was suffocating. The remnants of celebration, half-deflated balloons, wilted flowers, untouched slices of cake, had become ghostly reminders of the evening's original purpose. In the center of the living room, Ivy and Thomas sat frozen, their bodies slumped, eyes vacant, as though the recording of their confessions had drained the last of their strength. The memory of their voices admitting to attempted murder still rang in the room like a lingering echo. It was as if the walls themselves bore witness and judgment. Upstairs, George Thornhill stood by the window of his study, staring out into the darkened lake beyond the property. The water reflected the moonlight, still and unbothered, a cruel contrast to the emotional storm he battled within. He had done what he needed to do. He had protected himself, exposed the truth, and gained leverage that could bury them if necessary. But he did not feel victorious. He felt hollow. A knock came at the door. George didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he turned and walked to open it. Ivy stood there, hair disheveled, mascara streaked, a lost child trapped in a grown woman's body. "Can I speak to you?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. George stepped aside without a word. She entered the room like she had as a little girl, slow and hesitant, unsure of the consequences waiting on the other side. She glanced at his desk, at the photos of her as a baby, as a teenager in braces on her graduation day. Her chin quivered. "I know nothing I say will change what I did," she began, "but I need you to hear me." George sat in his chair, hands clasped in front of him, saying nothing. I didn't plan this on my own," she said. Thomas, he's been in my ear for years, telling me I'd never mattered to you, that you'd leave everything to the company, to strangers, that you still saw me as a child." Her voice cracked. And maybe I started to believe him. Maybe I was angry. Maybe I felt invisible. George's eyes didn't waver. "So you decided to kill me?" Ivy winced as if slapped. I was weak. I know that. But I didn't want to go through with it. Even when I poured that stuff in the cup, I kept hoping something would stop me, that you'd stop me. I didn't want it to happen, Daddy, I swear. He leaned back in his chair. And yet you watched me drink it. Tears ran down her cheeks again. I thought I had no choice. George stood up, walked past her to the bookshelf, and retrieved a slim folder. He opened it, revealing the will, the current version, still unsigned. "I was going to sign this tomorrow," he said, voice steady. "It would have named you sole heir, the company, the house, the accounts." Ivy gasped. He turned and looked her in the eye. "I had already decided. You had earned it. I just hadn't told you yet because I wanted to give it one more day. A clean, joyful day before changing everything." She swayed where she stood, as if the truth itself struck her harder than any punishment ever could. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." "No," George said. "You didn't care to know." He placed the will back into the folder, closed it, and slid it into the drawer. Downstairs, Thomas paced in circles. His usual smooth demeanor had fractured into frantic, muttering rage. He clutched his phone, tried to delete messages, texts, any trace that might connect him to their failed plan. But it was pointless. George had everything he needed, and the confession was already saved. He looked up as Ivy came down the stairs, pale and wordless. "What did he say?" he demanded. "Is he calling the police?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but it's over. We're finished." Thomas stepped forward. "What does that mean? He's given us a second chance?" "No," she whispered. "He's given us the door, and we're supposed to use it." He scoffed bitterly. "So that's it. He just cuts us off like animals?" Ivy didn't answer. She walked past him and into the guest room where their bags were still packed. She began placing items inside, one by one, methodically. Thomas stood frozen, watching her. "You're just gonna walk away?" "I tried to kill my father," she said. "What else do you think I deserve?" He followed her into the room. "You think you're better than me now? You think if you cry enough, he'll forgive you?" She zipped up the suitcase, looked him in the eyes, and for the first time in months, maybe years, there was no fear in her gaze, only clarity. "I don't care about forgiveness anymore. I care about living with myself." Thomas laughed. It was short, sharp, bitter. "You're pathetic." She picked up her suitcase and left him standing there. In the entryway, George was waiting. Ivy met his eyes but didn't speak. He opened the door for her, the cold night air rushing in. She stepped outside and paused, then turned. "I'll never forgive myself," she said, "but I hope someday you'll know I meant it when I said I was sorry." George didn't reply. She walked into the night. A few minutes later, Thomas came down the stairs with his suitcase. His face was hard, jaw clenched. As he reached the door, George spoke for the first time. "You should be in prison." Thomas turned slightly. "Maybe, but you're not calling anyone because you know that'll destroy your legacy." George's eyes narrowed. "It's already destroyed, the moment you walked into her life." They stared at each other. Then Thomas stepped out and disappeared down the path. George closed the door. The house was silent again. He walked through the rooms, turning off lights, stepping over scattered decorations. In the living room, he paused before the cold fireplace, picked up a framed photo of Ivy as a child, and stared at it for a long time. Then he whispered, "You were my world," and set the photo face down. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the windows of the Thornhill estate, casting golden patches onto the hardwood floors and antique furniture. But the warmth of the light did not reach George Thornhill's heart. The once vibrant house now felt cavernous, stripped of all pretense. The decorations from the night before remained in place, like forgotten relics from a celebration no one would ever mention again. George sat alone at the kitchen table. A steaming cup of black coffee sat untouched in front of him. His eyes were fixed on the wood-grain surface beneath his fingers, his mind far away. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ivy as a child, holding his hand at the zoo, crying when she scraped her knee, grinning with 2 missing front teeth. And then he saw her whispering over a vial of poison. The memory of the confession video was seared into him. Her voice cracking, her fingers trembling, her shame exposed. He had gotten what he wanted, the truth, the control, the final word. But at what cost? He rose slowly from the table and walked through the quiet house. Each step echoed. Every room held memories. The walls whispered fragments of a life that felt both close and unreachable. In the hallway, outside his study, he stopped before a framed portrait of Ivy at age 6, holding a stuffed giraffe and grinning. He reached out and touched the glass with trembling fingers. "You were supposed to be better than this," he murmured. Down the long gravel driveway, Ivy sat in the back seat of a cab with her suitcase beside her. She stared blankly out the window. Her phone vibrated once, a message from Thomas, terse and bitter, "Don't contact me." She didn't reply. She didn't even blink. Her face was pale and drawn, the shadows under her eyes heavy. But in her silence there was no more fear. Only quiet reckoning. The world outside the window rolled by slowly, and with each passing tree, she felt the weight of her choices settle deeper into her bones. She had almost killed the only person who had ever loved her unconditionally. She had thrown it all away, for pressure, for pride, for the cold whisper of a man who had long since lost his soul. At the next intersection, she tapped the driver's shoulder. "Can you stop here?" she asked. He pulled over, confused, but she handed him cash, stepped out, and walked. Her shoes crunched on the sidewalk. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't go home, not to Thomas, not to any place that reminded her of what she'd done. Meanwhile, back at the estate, George entered his office and sat heavily at his desk. He opened the drawer where the unsigned will still lay. For a moment, he simply stared at it, then slowly reached in and pulled it out. He tore it in half, then again, and again. The pieces fluttered like ash into the trash bin beside him. It was over. Not just the inheritance, not just the company, but the illusion, the dream he had carried for so many years that his daughter would one day take his place with pride and love. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of loss far heavier than the anger he had carried. A knock on the door broke the silence. Not a physical one, a digital one. A message pinged on his computer from his lawyer. "Received the confession video, instructions executed, Ivy and Thomas removed from the estate and corporate succession. Let me know if you want to proceed with legal action." George stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, after a long pause, he simply replied, "No legal action. Let them go." He closed the laptop. Later that evening, He sat in the living room with the fireplace glowing softly. No music, no voices, just the quiet crackle of the flames. He held a worn photo album in his lap, page after page of Ivy's childhood from her first steps to prom night. He flipped slowly, stopping on a picture of her sitting on his shoulders, giggling, reaching for a balloon. He ran his thumb across her face. "I still love you," he whispered, "but I don't know if I'll ever see you again." He closed the album. Across town, Ivy found herself standing before a small, nondescript building, a women's shelter. She didn't know why she had come there. She didn't plan it, but something inside told her it was time to strip everything away: money, status, shame, and begin again. Inside, a kind-faced woman greeted her. "You okay, honey?" Ivy hesitated, then nodded. "I just need somewhere to stay," she said, "for a while." The woman smiled gently. "You came to the right place." She led her inside, and for the first time in weeks, Ivy felt something other than despair. She felt the faintest flicker of hope. Back at the Thornhill estate, George stood once more at the window, looking into the night. Somewhere beyond the trees, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, unmoved by the storm of the past 24 hours. He closed his eyes. He had lost a daughter. But perhaps in some distant future, he might find her again. Not as the heir to his fortune, but as the child he once knew. Sometimes the deepest betrayals come from those we love the most. Would you have done what George did? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to see it.